Nerdcast assemble! Stay dandy, baby. There are a couple of constants in our wacky world. Water is wet, grass is green, and cartoons are funny. Ever since the days of Mickey Mouse whistling on a steamboat, or Bugs Bunny, who continues to torture Elmer Fudd to this day, cartoons have always been a comedic force. And whether you're watching a cartoon from, say, Warner Brothers or Disney or MGM, you have to admit that Japan has certainly had a lot of contribution to the world of comedic animation. And that's what brings us to today's Patreon review, which just so happens to be brought to you by Samuel Einhorn, who made a very nice donation through my Patreon page. Sam, my man, thanks to your generous donation, today I'm going to be taking a look at the very popular Mr. Osomatsu. Of all the Patreon reviews that I've done thus far, I think that Mr. Osomatsu has probably been the most difficult. You see, Mr. Osomatsu has a pretty long history to it, and I knew nothing of it as I was actually going into this series. In fact, as of the recording of this review, it's quite literally about to wrap up its third season. Its third season, so the show has to be pretty popular for a reason, right? My knowledge of Mr. Osomatsu was very small. All I really knew about the show is that it was based on an original 1960s comedy, anime, and manga series. It was sort of like a revival of that franchise, and it was all about these twin brothers who got into all sorts of wacky shenanigans. And pretty much that's the entire series right there. But there is a little bit more to it. There's a little more nuance, and there's also a lot of confusion. But that doesn't necessarily make the series bad, and there's actually a lot of things that I do like about it, so let me just give you sort of a quick rundown on the history of Mr. Osomatsu. Interestingly enough, Mr. Osomatsu is not a brand new anime series, but believe it or not, sort of like a sequel to an original manga and anime series which was called Osomatsu-kun. The entire series was created by Fujio Akatsuka. Now, during my research, I learned that Fujio Akatsuka is kind of a big deal in terms of pioneering comedic manga and anime in Japan. He's even referred to as the gag manga king. And one of his most revered works was a manga and anime series known as Osomatsu-kun, which was about a group of sextuplets who got into all sorts of wacky, crazy mischief and shenanigans, and that was basically it. Just a bunch of young brothers getting into wacky scenarios with lots of weird characters. But Mr. Osomatsu is a completely different beast. Mr. Osomatsu acts as sort of a sequel to this original series, showing the sextuplets as they're older and getting to see them as adults, as well as sort of honoring Mr. Akatsuka for his 80th birthday, which unfortunately he was not around to celebrate as he passed away in 2008. The good news is you don't necessarily need to look at the old manga or anime adaptations of Osomatsu-kun to appreciate Mr. Osomatsu. The series itself is completely random in terms of its storytelling, and most episodes actually have multiple stories within. It kind of plays out like an American cartoon. This is highlighted not only by its storytelling, but also just by the overall vibe and look of the series, which is very over the top and definitely goes for more of a sense of comedic look as opposed to trying to go for something that's a little more realistic. And it's this art style and its characters which honestly make Mr. Osomatsu really funny in the first place. That and the fact that it really just has no rhyme or reason for what it actually does. It's just meant to simply be funny. Although I have to admit, a lot of the humor of Mr. Osomatsu derives from Japanese culture. That being said, there's enough wacky, ridiculous, and slapstick humor to make just about anyone of any culture piss their pants with joy. Now, of course, there is the age-old saying that comedy itself is subjective, and a lot of people are going to have differing opinions on what they find funny or not funny in Mr. Osomatsu. What is objective, however, is the structure of a joke, how it's created, how it's presented, and luckily, Mr. Osomatsu is a grand success in terms of doing that throughout its series. That being said, you have to go into the show with a certain mindset if you are going to find yourself enjoying it, and I have to admit, the first half of the first season for me was kind of hard to get through, but then when I finally started to learn the quirks of all of the main characters and getting to see how the series was presenting itself, I found myself laughing quite a bit while watching the show. And it's the characters themselves which truly make this, not just the sextuplet group themselves, but the ridiculous side characters which supplement them. And I have to say that these characters are weird as hell. So you already know a couple of things. The series is about a group of sextuplets who basically are what are known as neats. What's a neat? Ah, I got it right here. So, a NEET is an acronym for Not in Education, Employment, or Training. Basically, a person who is unemployed and not receiving an education or vocational training. Basically, they're bums. This is honestly kind of accurate, as the main brothers themselves, the Matsuno brothers, are completely lazy and don't seem to want to do anything. They barely have motivation to carry about their normal lives, but they do have interesting personalities, which make all of them funny. And I have to admit, it was kind of confusing at first because they all basically look the same, but if you really look, you can see that there's actually some difference amongst all 6 of them. Leader of the group is Mr. Osomatsu himself. It's kind of weird that the entire series is sort of named after this singular character, despite the fact that it's all about sextuplets, but whatever. He's the eldest member of the group, so I guess that kind of makes him the default leader. And there's not much to his character aside from the fact that, yeah, he's real similar to his brothers, and he's kind of got some gambling addictions, but that's pretty much it. He also really likes to dress in red. Todomatsu seems to be the kindest member of the group, although he can be a little manipulative to others. Karamatsu is the badass member of the group, and I say that with big air quotations, but the fact of the matter is he thinks he's basically God's gift to women, and he basically thinks he's the coolest member of the group. Guess what? He's actually not, and that's what actually leads to a lot of the funny stuff with his character. Every comedic group needs a straight man, and that's where Korematsu comes in. He's definitely the most level of all of the characters, but again, just like a lot of the others, if it wasn't for the fact that he wears distinctive color, most often being green, you'd kind of forget that he's actually a part of the group altogether. And of course, every group is going to have a smartass, and that's where Ichimatsu comes in. Basically, he's just there to give a lot of really nice, good quips, and the fact that he does have a little bit of distinctiveness for the fact that he wears purple. Without a shadow of a doubt, my favorite member of the sextuplets is Jiushimatsu, and that's mostly because he is quite literally a living, breathing cartoon character. He's off the wall, he's insane, and he definitely has the most energy out of all of the characters. He's just wacky. That's the only way to put it. And pretty much the entire show just sort of follows the brothers as they get into various sorts of shenanigans and mischief and just regular everyday occurrences, whether it's simply just trying to find a job or hanging out with each other or simply going on wacky adventures which may or may not be real. There's just a lot of weird randomness in Mr. Osomatsu. Oh, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the side characters, who are maybe even weirder than the Matsuno brothers themselves. I shudder to call her the heroine of the series, but there's a main female character who goes by the name of Totoko. Basically, she's the object of affection for the Matsuno brothers, and she's also kind of selfish. Not much more to her character, aside from the fact that she does sort of supplement a lot of the comedy. I'd go as far as to say I think the funniest character in the series is Iyami. I mean, you just look at him and you just laugh. He's a ridiculous looking character, he's a con man, and he ends up being one of the funniest elements of the entire series. He's a cartoon character, and he knows it. There's also Chibita, who apparently is one of the former rivals of the Matsuno brothers, and there's not much to his character outside of the fact that he seems to have a lot more drive than them, and he seems to run his very own Odin noodle stand, so good for him. And then there's the big three. I call them the big three because to me they're the most ridiculous characters in the entire series, and I honestly don't know what to make of them. Tatabo, who is a super rich, childlike dude who seems to have a weird Japanese flag stuck in his head. There's Dekapan, who is a weird old Japanese man who seems to only wear large pants, and that's all there is to his character. I don't know, he's just weird. And then there's Dion. What the fuck is Dion? I couldn't tell you much about these characters. They're just weird for the sake of weird. Maybe they make more sense if you read the original manga, watch the original anime, but the fact of the matter is they are characters who seem like they were plucked from the 1960s and thrown into a modern anime, and maybe that's the joke. One thing that I thought was really interesting about the series is that apparently the very first episode of Mr. Osomatsu was removed from serialization. They don't even include it in any of the DVD or Blu-ray releases, and this makes it a very sought-after and rare episode of the series. And that's a shame, because in my opinion, I think it might be the funniest episode of the entire series, as it sort of takes the overall premise of Mr. Osomatsu and runs with it in the best way possible. I mean, the biggest joke of the series is that they're taking these classic 1960s anime characters and trying to put them in a modern setting and make them relevant and funny again. And that's something that's directly addressed in this removed episode. And what's also really great about it is how it really does poke fun at all of the tropes and overused things that we see in anime nowadays. Not to mention, of course, making fun of the most popular anime series at the time of its release. The first episode is remarkably funny, actually opening up in black and white, showing the brothers as they try try to contemplate how they're going to be perceived as funny to a modern audience and how they're going to have to adapt in the process, and that's when they finally start to make fun of a lot of different modern anime series by turning the brothers into a group of singing idols who seemingly have the ability to destroy comets with the beams that fire from their body, not to mention all the other callbacks to classic and modern anime, and even a giant poking fun at Attack on Titan. It's absolutely hilarious, and it's such a shame that the entire episode was removed. From what I've researched, this episode was pulled due to the fair use clause, something which apparently doesn't really exist in Japan, or at least it's something that's a little more strict in terms of what they actually have to do. In order to have actually really made fun of all these different things, they probably should have gotten permission from these various studios, creative properties and everything, but it just didn't work. It basically just ended up falling through the cracks, and again, it's a shame because if you weren't there during that time that the actual episode aired, you're probably not going to see it. But the fact of the matter is, it's the internet. Once it's there forever, and if you call your friends from the Straw Hat Pirates, they'll probably be able to find you a copy of that first episode. I know that I certainly had an opportunity to see it. But despite the fact that the first episode of this brand new revival anime comedy series is almost impossible to find, there's still a lot of material out there if you're interested in Mr. Osomatsu. And if you're a fan of gag comedy, which is to say something with a lot of really crazy animation, fun characters, and storylines which practically go nowhere and reset themselves by the time you get to the next episode, then this might be the one for you. I can't say whether or not I loved Mr. Osomatsu. I can say that I did not hate the show. It just felt a little off at times for me. I'm not the biggest fan of comedy anime, and I know that can be a little contradicting in the sense that a lot of my anime that I love does have comedic elements in it, but they tend not to be like the entire focus of the show that I'm watching. Mr. Osomatsu from beginning to end is an extreme comedy with extreme characters, and you can really tell that the people who worked on this, from the voice actors to the animators to the Studio Pierrot, are having a really great time in making this show, and it certainly has found its audience considering that they're 3 seasons in, and there could potentially be more of a bright future for Mr. Osomatsu, maybe even another sequel down the line. We'll just have to wait and see. What I will say is, it was a pretty funny show and an interesting experience to say the least. Again, I don't know if I love it. I definitely don't hate it, but it's certainly an interesting experimentation in that animation and comedy that I love oh so much. And maybe you'll get something out of it too. I'd really love to get your thoughts about Mr. Osomatsu. If you guys are actually a fan of this, if you like comedy, anime, if you had a favorite character or moment from this series. I'd also like to hear from you, Samuel Einhorn, the wonderful man who suggested that I check out this show. It was certainly an interesting experience. You told me if I should just watch a little bit of it or the entire season. I went ahead and watched the entire season, and I'm glad I did, because now I'm a little more dangerous now that I know a little bit more about Mr. Osomatsu. It's just really weird and kind of a giant cultural gap for me. Like I said, it's not filled to the brim with too much of like purely Japanese humor, but still, there were a lot of times where I just found myself scratching my head wondering, what the hell's going on? What is this? And why am I laughing so hard? So, yeah, there it is. A crazy series for crazy people. Maybe you're crazy enough. Like I said, tell me what you thought about it in the comments section below. And, of course, if you want to see more of Mr. Osomatsu in the future. Well, basically, that's it, guys. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate it. If you did like this video, please hit the like button. I'd really appreciate that a lot, too. I'd also like to go ahead and take this time to thank all of my patrons. You guys are awesome. You're the ones who make these type of videos possible. Thank you so much for those monthly donations. Remember, first-time donators, if you make a first-time donation, I'll review an anime series of your choosing. That's what made this video possible. Otherwise, I would have probably never watched Mr. Osomatsu. I'd love to add your name to this list of amazing people that you currently see on screen. You guys are the super producers of Ace Guru. So thank you guys so much for watching this review, and as always, stay down there, baby.